Welcome, you are watching episode 26 of the Mobility Talks, the web series by EIT Urban Mobility on all things mobility. And in today's episode, we will be discussing how cities and public transport authorities are getting more people onto public transport. The context is clear. Transport is responsible for a quarter of CO2 emissions, and according to the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, the proportion of public transport journeys in the world's cities must double in this decade to bring global emissions down, in line with keeping the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But as we often realize in these mobility talks, there are many interests competing in public space, and all have an impact on urban mobility choices. Different departments within city administrations will be calling for space to be allocated to their public service mission. And within urban mobility, there are many competing services responding to the same basic need, connecting A to B within a certain period of time. In that way, public space and urban mobility is not dissimilar to a chess game. There are moving parts, and they all have their own moving style, and all are moving to an ultimate deadline. The problem is that currently the queen is the car, and the king is the environment. And we're trying to avoid checkmate. So as public space is being rethought to be less car-centric, many alternative solutions and mobility services have proliferated alongside public transport. It sometimes distracts us from the value of public transport, but it also pushes public transport to evolve. And with the excellent speaker lineup we have in today's episode, get ready to explore some of these fresh takes and perspectives on public transport. But there is also something else which needs to be said. Public transport is an intrinsic part of the way we experience a city. You know where you are also because of the public transport you are using, as much as the cultural or historical landmarks and the language being spoken around you. And it's also a great thing to complain about and a perfect excuse for when you're running late. How would we justify being late for an appointment if we didn't have public transport? So, before I introduce you to the speakers, let me introduce you to yourselves. You were 100 to register, coming from 33 different countries, and Belgium equaling Spain this time. It's not often Spain gets challenged on our mobility talks, so well done, Belgium. And we also have a good mix of private and public sector representatives, so please, as usual, do get engaged in the chat and the questions tab. I'll be monitoring those and raising your questions and comments with our speakers today. So now let me welcome our four speakers. We have with us Thomas Geier. He is policy advisor at EMTA. Bea Cleeren, she is project manager for mobility at the city of Hasselt. Francesco Iacorossi, he is project coordinator at Eurocities. And Alexandre Durand is head of international sales at Instant System. Welcome to the four of you. Thank you very much for being with us today. Now, our main question is focused on getting more people onto public transport. But in terms of key performance indicators for cities and PTAs, what are actually the key metrics of success for public transport? Is it really about getting more people on board, or are there actually other factors at play? So I've asked each speaker to prepare a short presentation on this to give a bit their initial perspective on this issue. And so first up then is Thomas. Thomas, over to you. Take it away.
Yes, indeed. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's indeed start with that question. Is more public transport ridership better? And as a public transport professional, I was quite struck by the fact that I haven't actually asked that question to myself as much as I should have, I understood. So in these couple of minutes here as introduction presentation, let's simply explore that question together. But first to myself. My name is Thomas Geier and I'm working with the Transport Authority for the Vienna region in Austria. We're called VOA, Verkehrsverbund Ostregion, and we integrate all modes of public transport in Austria's eastern region into one consistent public transport offer. At least that's our mission and goal that we are supposed to achieve. In terms of size, we're about a third of Austria's landmass with about half of Austria's population, and with some 1 point something billion passengers every year, we're a large transport authority also in European perspective. And that European perspective is what I'm mainly working on, because VOR is one of the founding members of a club called EMTA, EMTA, which is a community of transport authorities from 35 European metropolitan areas. And in this EMTA group, we share knowledge, we collaborate on different projects and issues, but we also advocate for public transport, and we provide a sensible lobby to the European institutions when it comes to metropolitan public transport development. So this is a little bit my background with which I'm trying to approach this question, whether public transport, whether more is better in the sense of public transport ridership. And interestingly, each question can, of course, be answered or approached in different perspectives or from different perspectives. So I suggest that's exactly what we're doing now. So I just thought of a couple of perspectives here, which are quite interesting and curious with regard to the question of public transport ridership and whether more is actually good. So let's start with environment. An environmentalist might, in the first sense, think, yes, more public transport ridership is good, as was suggested also by the C40 community, as Jean-Paul has mentioned just before. However, if you think a bit more, then that's only the case if this more ridership actually stems from journeys that are already taking place in more polluting modes of transport. Because if public transport induces more ridership, which is new demand, so services that have not been, or journeys that have not been made so far, then this additional public transport ridership could actually increase emissions, as public transport still produces emissions as well. Far less than many other modes of transport, but we're far from being net zero in our sector. Coming to the philosophical perspective though, here I would say absolutely yes, more public transport ridership is better, because it allows for the inclusion of people in our economic and socio-economic services that do not always have the possibility to do so at the moment. And thinking philosophically, on the other hand, in our modern democratic societies, one of the biggest punishment that our state and our justice system can give us for doing the hardest of mischief is restricting our ability to move around, restricting our mobility. In that regard, allowing more mobility and allowing more mobility in a sustainable manner is what freedom in that sense is about. So from a philosophical perspective, yes, more mobility, and in particular, more mobility on public transport is a good thing. From a health perspective, one would also say, yes, that's a good thing, because a public transport journey never really starts at the starting point and never really ends at the destination. So you have a short walk or a bike ride connected to it, which is better than using the car from A to B and not moving your body. However, if we're replacing active mobility journeys with public transport, which is something we see, for example, when ticket prices are massively reduced or public transport becomes free, then people suddenly don't walk the distance of 3 bus stops anymore, but they will take the bus instead because it's free or paid for already anyways. And then it might actually be of a negative influence. A public transport operator would probably always say that more ridership is better because it increases their business. And even if it is a semi-public or a public agency, more business is better when you're dealing in an economic business setting. The city and PTA in the first instance might also think, yes, more is better. So it is a good metric. However, it might change if we consider peak time, where many of our services are already congested, or again, the very short journeys that we discussed in the health perspective. having more demand in peak times is incredibly expensive. So there needs to be a trade-off to what extent we should actually facilitate that. From a passenger perspective, no, more public transport ridership is not good, because an empty train has more comfort for yourself. Unless more ridership actually means we're increasing service level over time, then it might have a good repercussion. And for a car driver, yeah, public transport ridership, more ridership is actually a good thing, because it allows you to have a free road when everyone else is in the bus, so less congestion. In that regard, more public transport ridership, in my opinion, is a very good metric. However, there is better metrics that actually help us achieving that goal. And that might be an increase in modal share from car journeys to public transport, or the primary energy efficiency of the public transport system itself. An increase in ridership amongst groups that have very limited possibilities to take part in society at the moment. So specific targets. An increase in activity level. So how many minutes do you actually walk and move your body to get to your destination? And in the operation side of things, of course, aspects like punctuality and availability of accurate information, as well as incident management. For the city, the accessibility, the connectivity, so the actual functions and service levels of the system, but specifically the travel time relative to the same journey on the car or in the car could be a very interesting metric to look at. Passenger perspective, of course, is a satisfaction survey, which we're not yet good enough at. And for the car driver, the KPI might actually be the likelihood of using a park and ride service. So with that, I personally would say more public transport ridership is indeed better, but I'm looking forward to hearing what the other speakers have to say and to our discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Yeah, it's really interesting how you've already brought in several perspectives. That's very brave of you to look at it from various angles. So thanks, Thomas. Next up then is a city perspective. So with Bea, you're on next. So please, Bea, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, indeed, I am a project manager for the Department of Mobility in the city of Hasselt. And with that, well, from that role, I would like, oh, my internet clicker isn't working. I'm very sorry, Jean-Paul. There we go. So from that role, I would like to talk about the challenges we are facing right now with regards to public transport, because indeed, as my predecessor has said, from a city's perspective, we would like to have more people take public transportation. Of course, that would be great. But for the city of Hasselt, there are a couple of challenges that we're facing right now. And the first one, and it's a really big one, is that this region, being Limburg, it's a province, is poorly connected with regards to public transportation. It's something that we have known of for some time, and it's something that we are unable to fix as a city, of course, because we are very much dependent on the providers of public transportation, which are, we only have one provider for buses and one for trains. Those are public companies, so we are very much dependent on how they arrange their timetables and which services they offer in our region. Another thing we have to take into account with regards to public transportation is that in Belgium, there are a lot of fiscal benefits to company cars. It's something that has come to life like 20, 30 years ago, and it was an arrangement to enable companies to give raises to their employers without it costing them a lot of money. So it was actually cheaper for companies to give a company car to their employers than to give them a raise. So that's what we have to face in Hasselt. What are we doing right now to make sure or to enable people to use public transport more often is that we have like a buzzy pass for children from 6 up until 20 years old. So they can, in Hasselt, they get a pass to use the buses for free. We also have reduced rates for students and children for trains. And we have also been testing a mobility budget. So that actually means that we actually give a budget to the citizens of Hasselt, and they can use that on their mobility behavior. So they can use it to buy tickets for buses, for trains, but also for shared mobility. And we've actually noticed within that test that most of the budget was used to for public transportation, which is actually pretty good. In Flanders, we also have the hopping points. This is an initiative from the government, which means that you have like these mobility hubs where you can cross over from one mobility modality to another one. So you have parking space for your car, and you can take the bus there or hop into a shared bike or something like that. And we also pay a lot of attention to our pedestrians, to our bikes. We are trying to make the city a lot more green, to have more rooms for pedestrians and bikes instead of for the king car, of course. So what is our vision for the future? We are trying to get the car out of our city center and also out of our university and college hub we have here in Hasselt. So we're introducing the trambus, which is a special type of bus that will link the colleges, the universities by means of public transport to most of the places where the students come from. We also like to reduce car ownership by means of maybe that mobility budget, if we can carry that out. And we also focus on multimodal mobility. So we have some parking spaces in the periphery of the city where you can park your car for free and then continue the last mile by bike or by bus or stuff like that. So that's something that we're really putting a lot of effort in. And for us, so our KPI with regards to public transportation is more or less linked to the use of car, because we don't necessarily want people to take the bus instead of the car, but we want to make people make a good choice with regards to their mobility. So if the bike is a good alternative, please use that. If you have access to shared mobility, please use that. You don't have to take public transport, but you can use it as part along the way you have to go. So that was it for me, actually. This is me. If you want to contact me, you can find my contact details right here. And I'll gladly pass on the word back to Jean-Paul.
Thank you, Bea. Yeah, for you actually started to look at some of these broader considerations in cities, and yes, maybe to come back to Thomas's point, more people using might be a problem. At the same time, you're also raising the point that there are some real uses that need to be guaranteed in the city, and some target groups are really important to allow them to move around. So thanks for making those points, and we'll bring some more up in the discussion. Okay, next up is Francesco for the upper project at Eurocities. So Francesco, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And after both colleagues highlighted the plus and the minus of enriching the public transport with passengers. Next, please. And today I'm trying to give you a tangible commitment from EU funded in order to fill the gap. First of all, I'm Francesco Iacorossi. I'm a project coordinator, and I'm currently working at Eurocities, which is a community of more than 200 European cities. We gather over 150 million people. We're mainly involved in European EU-funded projects. We actually have 29 so far. We manage 40 working groups, and we're quite known EU-wise, we involved in many EU-funded projects. I'm from the mobility department, I'm the sector, but we have 9 thematic areas, so we try to cover a broad range of activities. Next, please. When it comes to upper is quite of an ambitious project. It started backward, please. Yes. It works with 10 cities and regions in Europe. As you can see from the map, also geographically well structured. It has 40 partners and it lasts 48 months. The budget is almost 20 million euros and is coordinated by UITP. We have quite, as I was saying, we have a quite ambitious goal, which is first of all to increase public transport uptake by over 30%. And on the other hand, we want to increase user satisfaction as well. And our aim is to increase it by over 25% without leaving anyone behind. Next, please. The methodology of the project, we will try to implement a combination of over 80 measures, which aim ideally to push people out of private cars and to pull them closer to public transport or active mobility measures across Europe. So it goes back to what my colleague was saying before. We will act on 5 innovation modes, mindset and culture, urban mobility planning, mobility service ecosystem, road network management, and democratic governance. The idea of the project is to have, during the first and the second year to develop these measures, and then year 2 and 3 to implement them and to measure the actual impact. Next, please. We are going to be supported by these EU tools, which the idea is to give support to the demonstration sites in order to implement their measures. 7 tools will be developed in the course of the project. These are all designed to complement, as I said before, the push and pull measures throughout the life cycle. And the aim is to maximize the impact and ensuring that citizen participation is there. I mean, understanding the behavior, because many factors contribute to have more people on board, and also the transferability, scalability, and the uptake and the replication of public transport solution will be a big part of the project and in the end of the project. Next, please. One thing which hasn't been mentioned by my previous colleagues is the role of communication and dissemination. Somehow, this activity is quite underestimated. But in this project and other projects as well, we found out that having a peculiar and communication and dissemination about the results you achieve, it can be a good results or a bad results, is crucial to engage properly with the citizenship. We actually, within Upper, we revolve around 3 main pillars. The first one is the mobility as a right. Then we have enhancing the attractiveness of public transport. And the last one is to focus on local communication and dissemination activities through political representatives. So political will really matters. The MAR concept is a quite new concept. And I'm happy it was also cited as one of the pillars of future transport system by the EGON group, which also Thomas is part of it. And so we produced the document in January, and I invite you to go to have a look at it, because it's quite interesting to have it. We based our project on the assumption that accessibility and inclusiveness mean freedom, because sometimes we have the tendency to blame citizens for not getting on board. But we did in a workshop in Barcelona last year, and we asked politicians, local politicians within the upper cities, if a mea culpa was needed by the administrations, also by public transport users. But it's somehow an easy way out to blame passengers for not getting on board. But we should turn the concept upside down and, posing ourselves the question why, citizens are not getting on board. Surely COVID hit us, and we lost a big percentage of people on public transport, have shifted to private modes like cars, for instance. Next, please. But the question we need to pose ourselves is to, a proper communication is important. A mea culpa is also important from public transport system. And so communication, it can be a key element in achieving this ambitious goal to restore faith in public transport users, and also try to engage with new public transport users. These are all the channels we have developed so far within APAR. Please go through it, link, follow, and subscribe. Do your best. We will monitor the success of the project also by our followers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. That's an interesting thought, to have a KPI being freedom, like more freedom through public transport, especially when, the car has probably been the biggest symbol of freedom in mobility to some extent. So that would be an interesting take on things, as we're talking about some kind of, behavior change, accompanying a behavior change, which doesn't necessarily ring freedom completely as well. So that's an interesting philosophical conversation for us as well to add on to our list. Thanks, Francesco. Last up then is Alexandre, last but not least, because Alexandre is working across many different cities. So please, Alexandre, over to you. Tell us what you think are proper KPIs for public transport.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. So I'm going to be on the tough job here, because I will represent the private sector voice. But in our case, we only have sense doing our solution just to do them for the public transport authorities and public transport operators. And we actually are also member of the HUPER and the SPINE project, which are the two European sister projects. So it will be a key element on how we are involved on trying to make things better toward public transport. So the title is pretty generic, the next generation mobility as a service. Today, I will not go over the famous definition of what is MaaS, but what I can tell you today is that MaaS is not a magical tool. MaaS does make sense only after a coherent mobility policy and every action that public transport authorities and public transport operators can really do to promote public transport. So I like to consider ourselves an enabler more than this magic tool that sometimes people have in mind. A quick recap on who is InsoSystem. InsoSystem is proposing digital mobility solution, as I said, mainly for public transport authorities and public transport operators. We have more than 100 clients all over Europe. Our solution are used by more than 11 million users, and we are a small, medium company of 110 employees. So if you look at some logos here, maybe you will recognize some of them when you get to have a good traveler companion in some of the cities here. Maybe one quite popular after the Olympics that you can see in Paris. Today, I will try to give you key aspects on why MaaS is helping to bring people more on public transport, but I will take three particular axes that really benefit on this idea that MaaS is really enabling a mobility policy. We analyze and we encounter three main, let's say, axes that I want to share with you today. And these axes are the following. We would like to prove how MaaS can be an enabler in social inclusiveness, in accessibility, and in safety. Why? Because these three topics are usually one of our barrier to public transport. And we would like to show how we can be overcoming this barrier thanks to an initial mobility policy in place. I will start with social inclusiveness because we are talking about how we can shift people from car to public transport, but we need to think of people that don't have any choice than taking the car because they are not covered by a good enough public transport services. And I saw some of my colleague before mentioning it, but the park and ride is one of the steps, because when people cannot have any other choice than taking the car, the idea is to find them the best solution to still reach their final destination, but to use the car as less as possible. And that's really the meaning of park and ride. And where we can think that technology is a good enabler is not giving only an itinerary proposal with, like, the classic, like the next door park and ride. But in our technology, what we tend to do is to analyze all the possibilities to indicate to the users the most efficient connection between park and ride and public transport, meaning that we maybe tend to not bring to the closest park and ride, but where it brings you to a high frequency tramway, subway, or bus that will bring the users to the final destination. Why? Only because in order to help people shifting from car to public transport, we need to give them valid alternatives. Otherwise, people are human. Human are not very eager to change, and the easiest solution is always to take the car from A to B. So we need to give them real alternative to do so. Another example, to cover it quickly, and once again, it really depends on the strategy that has been implemented by the public transport operators, but social inclusiveness today is also represented by integrating on demand. On demand is a specific service. Usually people doesn't even know about this service. What we tend to do is to give them a seamless experience between the combination of on demand that brings them to a mobility hub and then carry on the journey with public transport, with micromobility. So something that is going to bring them, once again, a very easy and accessible journey. The other example and barrier I want to promote here is accessibility. When I say accessibility, is not only for reduced mobility people, but we need to think of people that are elderly people, parents with trolleys, so they don't have easy way to move around. And to do so, we did some solution, and this is some solution that we actually benefit from innovation called from the EIT, and we deploy in Brest, where we can, based on your profile, be aware of potential issue on your walking part of your trip, giving you a notification of what is the best recommendation, and give you also a fully accessible trip with public transport, having reference everything concerning if the bus is accessible, if the bus stop is really accessible, because for this category of users, it's really a hassle to understand what is their options. Last one, safety. Once again, we need to put our feet in the basket of the people that make their choices. And once again, safety is one of the key elements. In this case, I want to promote active mode. So it can be like your own bike or sharing mobility. So giving you indication on how is the trip the safest, using the most bicycle lanes. Once again, it's something that we also use to promote some infrastructure where authorities did a lot of expenses, investment, and in order for this investment to be benefited by the users, we need to provide them a clear understanding, a clear vision of everything that has been done and that has been done to facilitate their way inside the city. So I think I'm out of time, but I will join my colleague Bia earlier, because I think the best KPI in this case is not really how people shift to public transport, but how people shift away from car. Because in the end, active way, sharing mobility, public transport and this derivative, DRT, are as most important than taking the car. So once again, we tend to be this enabler, and I'm eager to have a panel discussion right after to maybe go deeper into the subject.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alexandre. And yeah, you introduced a couple of other, KPIs one could have on public transport. How much is it accommodating for very specific user needs, and how much is it being responsive to individual requirements? How much is it proactive on providing information as well on what's coming up, on how safe certain routes are, and all the rest of it. So yeah, that gives us a pretty good picture, quite different perspectives from all of you. So thanks for that. I would like to start our conversation maybe also with a reflection on public transport itself, because as I would see it, public transport, the image I have is necessarily a collectivized form of transport where you would have a lot of people in a certain type of vehicle moving at a certain frequency throughout the day, and that seems to be maybe possibly a little bit of a traditional view of public transport. I don't know, but I'd like to hear you on that. I mean, is public transport necessarily a collective form of transport, or has that notion of public transport itself been challenged by this, proliferation of individual modes of transport in cities, which is also then pushing public transport to incorporate to some extent also individual modes of transport? I'm thinking maybe of things like shared vehicles or things like that. So do you see that really as part of public transport or not? Maybe Thomas first.
I do indeed. And quite interestingly, both us here in Austria and many of our colleagues in the EMTA community are quite actively looking into this demand responsive service development. Yeah, so of course the bread and butter work of public transport is collective, high capacity, hopefully high frequency means of transport, which can move a lot of people, and that is a business case that works really well in densely populated areas, right? And in certain temporal dimensions, like commuter journeys in the morning and so on. But if we look at, let's say, afternoon hours in suburbs or more rural areas, or we even get into evening hours in cities, then we can certainly notice that there is a mismatch of capacity and demand. And out of this mismatch came this idea of actually making more flexible public transport solutions that you order with an app. So really this demand-driven, demand-responsive transport. Interestingly, in Austria, in order to not have legal trouble with the taxi sector, we are still obliged, or we also still want to make sure that the vehicle ideally services several journeys in one go, right? So in a sense of pooling different journeys into one drive. So we're obliged to do that because otherwise we would be competing with the taxi services. But it's also really where the efficiency comes from, right? And there is fantastic technology providers out there that really allow us to enable a service level to customers that is unheard of in many rural areas. For example, we have one region a bit outside of Vienna. It's a town of 12,000 with its surrounding villages. and we used to have bus service there once an hour, right? And now we actually have a service where you can call your flexible transport service, which then is an electric minivan for like 8 people. And you have the guaranteed service within 20 minutes. So that's quite incredible. So if I look back, I grew up in a town like that in southern Germany. And if I had such a service available during my youth, that would have been a total game changer, right? So talking about freedom of mobility and talking about that freedom to people that simply cannot drive, either because of their age or because of their income, or any other reason, you actually open the possibility to participate. So in that regard, I think this direct, distinct line between what public transport is and whether demand responsive service is part of the public transport offer or something purely commercial is really something that our sector is in the midst of finding out how to connect these two service modules. And many PTAs are quite actively in that. I think frontrunner is our colleagues in Copenhagen, actually, with their flex traffic services.
Okay, that's interesting. And Bea, you also talked about these mobility hubs, let's say, or these places where you could then leave the car and connect to something else. So this is in a way another way of looking at it to some extent. So less on the custom solution through public transport, but more sort of a hub where you can drop your car and then connect with the more collective public transport. So one question is, what are your thoughts on these more individualized forms of public transport, let's say? Do you consider that as part of public transport or not? And the second one is a question from the audience. So what is the biggest motivation to leave your car in a mobility hub and travel that last mile then with an alternative form of transport in Hasselt? So these two questions.
Well, let me start with the second one. What is the best motivation? Well, we don't have enough public space anymore to cater for all the cars that want to be parked here in the city. We have some underground parking, which you have to pay for, and there is close to no free parking anymore in the city of Hasselt. So that's the best motivation ever. Leave your car just outside the city border, and Hasselt isn't a big city. You can walk through it. So leave your car just outside of the city for free, and then walk to the city, take a shared bike, or something like that, especially for people that don't live in the city, but have to be here quite regularly on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Students, people who work here, that's a very good alternative for them to use. There is also a bus line that connects that parking space to the city center. So hopefully that's a good motivation, because the fact that a modal shift should be apparent for everyone who noticed all the climate changes and how the world is going. It's a modal shift is going to be inevitable, but it's not a good enough reason for people to leave the car behind, because it's not a practical. It is for some people, but not for most of the people, who then have something like, okay, but I need my car. I can't live without my car. So that's how we're trying to solve it, by making sure that the car has its place, because it needs its place, especially here in Limburg. You have to, using public transportation to get around Limburg is pretty hard. It costs a lot of time, a lot of money. So you need a car, but you need a car in the right space, not in the city center, or not in a park or something like that. So hopefully that's a good motivation enough for people that are visiting Hasselt. And sorry, I lost track of the first question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you half answered it, because I had the impression it was indeed collective transport from the moment you've parked your car. But could you just comment then on how at Hasselt you're viewing public transport, not only maybe as a collective form of transport, but that there are also some individualized forms? And do you consider that to be public transport as well?
That's a tough question. What is public transport? Of course, is a taxi public transport as well? So in our view, everything that isn't privately owned transportation is public transport. So a private car isn't public transport, but a shared car is, more or less. So that's why we encourage all forms of transportation, whether it be in big masses or in like really tailored to the bone for some people. But the question then rises: a bus that is actually transporting one person, is that public transport, or should that person then not better do that journey with a car, because a bus takes up a lot more space than a car? So that's very interesting to think about. In Hasselt, we do have a lot of empty buses as well, especially in the evening hours, as Thomas already said. It's a good way of transporting in the peak hours when a lot of people needs to be transported, but in the evenings it's a bit more difficult. However, can you then say, there's not a lot of people on the bus, so let's just skip it? No, because the bus needs to be reliable. You need to be able to take the bus when you want to take the bus. So it's a very difficult question, which we are struggling with as well, especially the reliability of the transportation modes is a very big working point here in Hasselt. Yeah.
And I can imagine that's increasingly challenged as we see lots of new mobility services coming into cities that are highly individualized, highly responsive, start when you need them to start, stop when they force you to stop, I guess, if you haven't paid as far as you wanted to, but they're still very responsive. If I go back to you then, Francesco, as you opened up the question of freedom, in this discussion between collective and individual forms of transport, I mean, I guess the freedom has to be the individual form of transport, right? And so do you also see public transport as being pushed towards, opting for more individualized forms of public transport? Or do you see still a big role for collective forms?
Well, it also depends on the environment we're talking with. If we talk about large cities, collective transport is a must-have service, because otherwise you won't be able to move people around the city in an intelligent way. But all actors have a role to play when it comes to getting around the city. So to me, public transport also within Upper, we have different actors. We have public transport operators. Then we have the European Cycling Federation, the International Federation of Pedestrians. We have the Passengers Federation. So we did try to have all the perspectives, to have a clear view and an honest perspective of what's public transport in a wider conception. So collective it has to be there. But then, if you want to cycle, if you want to hire a trottinette, if you want to go with your own bicycle, if you want to go with a shared options, to me, it's all good. I come from a city, Rome, and we have 640 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. So our city is infested by cars. So any alternative way will do to me. And
okay,
that has to be extremely clear. It doesn't only apply to Rome, but large cities have a very complex role to play. And to my personal view, and also based on my experience on public transport project, there's a wide range of public transport means of transport, and they're all good to me.
And just a quick question coming in as well on the Upper project, as you mentioned, the International Federation of Pedestrians, I think you said. Are citizens directly involved in some of the measures that you're building there? Are they part of that?
Yeah, this is one of the first requests we pose to all the cities, because sometimes I can be an expert on a particular field of transport, but I don't have any experience on a particular district of the city. So my philosophically, I can have a lot of the literature can say something, but on the reality doesn't apply on the literature. So the engagement with the population is vital. Also because we want them to tell us what's wrong with public transport. I want a citizen to tell me I'm not getting on board for these, and these. Otherwise, it's me, putting medals on my chest and be like, I have the answer. But my answer doesn't necessarily apply to the everyday life of citizens. So engaging with the citizenship is extremely important.
Okay.
Also,
thank you.
sorry, I finished. Also, we're developing hackathons within Upper, and that's another major aspect which helps us a lot, because sometimes we only rely on middle-aged men or women. Through hackathons, we had a chance to engage with university students, and they gave us a completely different view of what we were thinking.
Yeah, no, it's not easy always to involve citizens, but it's good that that's part of the project. It is important to get that feedback. And if I go then to Alexandre on this notion of collective versus individual, I mean, in the way you're presenting your service, let's say, you clearly build a patchwork of options. So I think I would understand where you would be going. But still, I would like to hear you on that. And a question also specifically on the safety aspect that you mentioned coming in from the audience. You talked about, for instance, getting information on obstacles that might, alert certain people that there might be an obstacle on their way, on their route. Just how do you actually go about defining what an obstacle is, and how much detail do you provide, and that actually work? So maybe just your thoughts on collective versus individual, and then that specific question on safety.
So yeah, as was organized my presentation, you know already the answer. So yes, in our vision, we tend to be the representation of all mobility services specific to a territory. And so for us, indeed, the idea is to be including every way of transport, obviously towards sustainability. And to do so, actually, I will take also a quick example that Bea mentioned. Bea mentioned that parking is a big issue, and this is a main reason why people don't take the car. And because we own our own algorithm in our trip planner, what we tend to do also is to really take in consideration every factor. So traffic jam is a factor. Parking space is a factor as well, actually, because when we give options to users, obviously we don't exclude car, because excluding car will be excluding people. And what we tend to do is to be realistic. And if there is a specific information about how much time do I usually spend to find a parking spot in city center, this is something that we can add in our algorithm in order to give a representation of truth. So going from A to B to car will be easy for you as a user, because you don't have to be aware of anything else. But consider that you need to add traffic jam, time to find a parking space, and at this point, public transport, or what I prefer to use is intermodality with public transport, can be way more efficient than taking your car. So yes, indeed, complexity of mobility offer is, as per said, a complexity that we resolve with mass, but is also a really key to be competitive to car, and then creating this model shift, which is in the end the most important, and not because it's toward public transport, because it's only towards sustainability, which is way more important. So I think I answer your first question. Your second question, actually, just a quick mistake. When we were talking about safety is mainly when people use active modes, so where they are more in danger than being in a bus, meaning using sharing mobility or their own bike. So this is for us a way, and one of our partner, which is actually very famous in Europe, which is GeoVelo, giving alternatives routes depending on the level of safety the user want to take. So if the user want to be the fastest possible, it will take more risk. But if the user has more time, we'll give him an itinerary with the most accommodating routes. So this is safety. And you were mentioning the problematic of obstacles. So it's something that we did concerning accessibility. So people with trolley, people with wheelchair, they will have issues finding their way on the walking part of a trip. So in this case, we did some experimentation where we can integrate data from crowdsource, so people can declare a potential obstacle on the road. So basically what it is, it can be construction, work in progress, or it can be an incident or everything like this. And today, hopefully, with a new innovation call from the EIT Urban Mobility, if we win, we will add a new solution that allows AI to recognize by satellite images automatically the safest routes for people with these issues, meaning that we will give them details on how you need to go through roads, crossing roads, pedestrian roads. So all the indication that will give them let's say an easier life in their mobility.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So what I want to do now is a bit of a quick fire. Okay, I would like to put up a poll that EIT Urban Mobility released on their LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago for this Mobility Talks. And the question of the poll is, what do you think is the most crucial factor for increasing the use of public transport and shared mobility in cities? Can we put up the answers to the poll, please, so that we can all see that? So the options were seamless mobility integration, more frequent reliable service, affordable transport for all, or public awareness campaign. So the single most crucial factor. And from the community, it's clearly that the reliable service peaks as more than 50% responded that. Second comes seamless mobility integration. So I would like to hear our four panelists on this. Quick fire, quick response. I'll start with Thomas. What is it for you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, yeah, very boring, but I very much agree with the herd thinking here. Indeed, if we have the services in place, people use it. And then it becomes the question of how easy can we make it for people to use that service? So that's exactly the hierarchy as I would have chosen as well, indeed.
Okay, brilliant. Bea?
Yeah, I would actually like to add one more. I think people would like to feel safe on public transport because there's been a lot of forms of aggression on buses, on trains towards the drivers, but among the passengers as well. So I would think yeah, of course, the most important one is the bus needs to be there when you think it's going to be there, but it needs to be safe as well. It needs to be a safe environment.
Yeah. Understood. Francesco, what would you have said? You were an advocate of communication. I'm curious to hear you. A quick unmute, maybe, Francesco.
Apologies. I said I'll go for the 5% of the communication, and because I think if if a campaign will be launched to intercept citizens and making them aware of all the possibilities they have to get rid of the cars, for instance, or to make them aware of the network of public transport within their neighborhood or the whole city, I think a little percentage can be taken on board. So I'll go for the also a behavioral change campaign, you name it. I think it might be not the solution, but it will surely contribute to having more people on board, more conscious people on board.
Thank you. And Alexandre?
I'm perfectly in line with what has been the highest number, because as I said before, math is not a magic tool, but what we can do and what can technology does actually is help user to have more trust between the service and the user, meaning that, yes, indeed, high frequency reliable services is obviously an excellent option. But what we can try to help, technology can help. Today, with technology, we can be able to know exactly where is the bus at any time, which is called the vehicle monitoring. And this is kind of functionality we bring thanks to the MAS. Same with integration with mobility apps. It's exactly what we do. We try to offer a seamless experience for the users to move differently with every services which are available. But we cannot be the magic tool inventing reliable services. We are not the one inventing mobility services. We are only a representation of what has been the mobility policy done by PTA. And so obviously the job of PTAs is the most difficult job.
So then let's go a bit further and on the job itself, because clearly we've established that public transport is not like a separate mode of transport from private transport to some extent, because, you know, vehicles can be in both. It's not just collective. There are many other ways that public transport can operate. But the question is, what is the actual responsibility of cities and public transport authorities? I mean, do they have to play an operational role on the actual mode of transportation, or are they rather, you know, in charge of facilitating mobility in all its shapes and forms in the city, working with all sorts of private, public-private type partnerships across the city, integrating new mobility services into the whole patchwork, providing a general offer for mobility in a city? So what is the kind of role then for public transport authorities and cities? Bia, when you're trying to organize all of this, how would you define your role as an operator or more as a kind of governor, facilitator? And do you see that you know, these new forms of mobility are reducing in a way the potential for public transport, or quite the contrary, increasing the potential for public transport?
Well, I think that the city should be more like a governor role in that way, that they should enable all those mobility providers to provide their services in the city. And they should make it easy and clear to all the citizens and all the people that are visiting the city which services they can use within that city. I think that's the role for the local government to play within this story. It should not be the local government who has to decide which services will be available in the city. No, everyone is welcome, and they shouldn't decide upon the price or how the services are operated, but they should enable all those operators to operate within the city. If I make myself clear, it's a lot of operation in one sentence. So I think that's our point of view here within the city of Hasselt. Mobility providers, like shared mobility providers, have to have some kind of license here in the city to operate. But we do not limit the number of operators. We do not intervene with their business model. The only thing we might do is ensure that citizens of the city of Hasselt get a reduced price for those services. But we do not intervene with the business models, and we shouldn't. The market should stay private, and the providers should be able to should be able to build their business any which way they would like. It's market response, of course. I don't know if that answers your question, Chapo.
Yes, because I mean, it's also introducing this notion of the link between the public, sometimes public operator, and then you have the private operator, but then you also have the public governor who sort of stands a little bit over everything. And maybe Thomas also can build on that, because I think also the example of shared mobility is quite a good one in this sense, you know, because there are some shared mobility operators that are, you know, really public operators, but they are then competing against private operators. What's the best option for public transport authorities and cities to take? Thomas.
Yeah, if I knew that, I'd have a very successful consulting business. Yeah, that's the $1 million question. But no, honestly, it might be a bit of an old message now, but as we're in a European community here now today in this call, I think there is no one size fits all in this. And within EMTA, we have 35 regions as members. And that means we have 35 different models of how they approach this. And I think there's some merit in having that difference and that very local contextualization. So Bea's input, what you just mentioned, like this market play in the field of shared mobility, that works quite well in Belgium and the Netherlands as well, because there's lots of like cycling infrastructure. So cycling is very easy and encouraged and so on. But if you go further south in Europe, you actually see that there's way more involvement of the cities themselves. Here in Vienna, for example, the public bike share is operated by a private operator, Next Bike, but it is under a tender or a lease of the city, right? So there's a quite active role of the city in the operations on where there should be bikes and how often they should be replenished and what the pricing scheme should be, and so on and so forth. So these models do exist. And I think that's fine, because even though we're discussing this for so long already, we're still in an early stage to actually find out what the different roles of these different organizations really are. What I would like to point out is one thing. While I agree with the notion that Bea in her earlier intervention also introduced this idea of public transport is everything that is like accessible publicly, right? Like without private ownership and so on. I do agree with that notion. I just think if that's the case, then we also need to establish a new notion for what is traditional public transport, like really fixed line on a route with a fixed fare, hopefully integrated across the different modes of bus, train, metro, tram, etc. Because that construct in itself, like this traditional public transport or collective public transport, or whatever the notion is we're going to use from now on, has its own problems, its own challenges, and its own right to develop itself without always having to consider also the shared mobility sphere. We need to consider it both, and we need to consider both of them individually as well, because we owe it to all of these systems to develop them in their proper rights. Because also with collective public transport, there's still a lot of goals we can achieve. And then we haven't even introduced car sharing and bike sharing at every metro station yet, right? So there's lots going on. And I tend to agree with your notion, Jean-Paul, that the PTA and PTAs are like extended arms of cities or regions in that sense, right? They're specialty agencies in public ownership. They have this overarching kind of governance role in forging that market. And in some European countries where market forces are stronger, where entrepreneurship is more in the culture, that may lean towards more of a kind of collaboration with market parties. And in other countries or regions, it might really more be a tender model where the city or the PTA quite defines in quite detail what kind of services they'd like to see produced. Ideally, we should have all of this in a non-discriminatory manner, which means that even though you're doing a tender, there should not be any kind of exclusion of an entrepreneur that would like to compete, even though that is a very difficult uphill battle, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, there is this tension, because also behind the notion of the public transport operator, there is also in public transport an element of public service, which goes beyond being really competitive, being reliable. That there's something else going on with the public service. It's, being guaranteed, throughout the day, at all times, to provide a service to people. And that's something that private operators don't necessarily need to operate with, this notion of a public service, and yet in terms of mobility, there is a competition. But I can see this tension a little bit. I don't know, maybe Alexandre also, you would like to react to that one.
Yeah, actually, my answer can be very quick. Governance. I do believe in governance. I think Thomas follows me here. because governance to PTA is something that allows them to build mobility policies. And once again, I will only take our perspective as a private sector, but what we then can provide through our mass solution is data. Data that is for the PTA and allows them to understand demand and offer, and how balance our services regarding the request, basically, and giving this technology, the tree planner, the services integration, we have the capacity of giving a full picture of the way people behave, and how they change over time. And this is basically called in our field the business intelligence. But this is a key aspect, and I really believe in the governance. So I still think that even if ideally it's a free market and everybody can provide a service, I still think that an organization behind all of that makes sense, because a mobility policy is still needed. Otherwise, it's kind of chaos and it's not actually providing the services that citizens are expecting. But this is only my personal opinion, more than a private sector opinion.
No, it's interesting. And Francesco, what is your view then on this public service versus the actual operation of the mobility itself?
Oh, I think we need to find a compromise between these two things, which are both very active in our cities nowadays. So they need to talk to each other. They need to understand each other. Through the years, if we talk about shared mobility services in cities, mainly large cities, we have witnessed a robust development in the service provided by private companies. At the very beginning of, in around the year 2010, we were overwhelmed by private companies, especially bike sharing, which provided an awful service to the city, and they gave a really bad name to private share companies, because we had tons of bicycle abandoned, loads of trottinettes abandoned in the city center, and they just left. So it was hard for cities to trust again these companies, and also to try to refresh the name. The idea of having private investors in the cities nowadays, in many cities, especially Rome, we have the municipality had a gap, a cap of companies. We have 3 companies. We have a cap number of vehicles around the city. Also, the radius of the city has been extended, so it was primarily in the city center. Nowadays, also the outskirts of the city is provided with the share system, and I sense that also the acceptance by the citizenship is much better than in previous years. You still have a lot of wrongdoings, people going two people on a trottinette, or you have a lot of wrongdoings, but we witnessed a lot of wrongdoings by car drivers, and we tend to turn a blind eye on these wrongdoings. So I think private sector is needed, but cities need to talk to them. Otherwise, it will be private companies will try to take advantage of the cities. Maybe they due to the lack of experience, due to the lack of commitment.
Mm-hmm. And Bea, I think you wanted to react as well earlier to something I was saying on the public service.
Yeah. Of course, governance is key in this in this topic, of course. But with regards to the public service, you were saying about the fact that the public transport has to perform a public service, but also don't forget that it is paid for by public money as well. So it's not just a public service they have to perform, but it's actually our taxpayers' money that goes directly into public transportation. So it's very painful then to see if there are money cuts and stuff like that in the traditional public transportation modes, Thomas, from the government. Because in Dutch we say dweilen met de kraan open. It's actually trying to mop up the water while the tap is still running, actually. So we have our thoughts on those private initiatives now, because they are not regulated by the government. They are not dependent on taxpayers' money. But as Francesco said, you as a city, you have to talk to those private entrepreneurs and make sure that their service is well equipped and well followed up on, especially for the good of the visitors and the citizens of the city. Yeah.
So you bring up the notion of taxpayers' money, so that's actually probably quite a nice way to start, wrapping up here, because there's also then this notion of, investment. So what are we doing with this money as public transport operators, as cities, and where should we actually be investing? And there have been several experiments around, making public transport a lot more accessible, for instance, by, making it free, offering free tickets, that kind of thing. So you can act on a pricing element under this to get more people to use public transport. But there are probably many other ways of investing. We talked about, frequency, reliability, all the rest of it. I would like to hear you then on what do you consider being the best investment actually for cities and PTAs to get more people onto public transport. Thomas, what's your views on these kind of pricing policies, and what would you say should be the best investments?
Well, you gave a bit of a caveat to your question at the very end, and that's probably a good thing, because obviously it depends on what you really want to achieve. If you want to ensure customer retention in public transport, so those that already do commute by train and bus and so on, then these price initiatives that we've seen across Europe, I believe it started in Austria with the climate ticket, and then it moved into Germany with this €9 ticket monthly pass during the summer of, I believe, 2022. And then since last year, there's this monthly pass that allows you on metropolitan and regional public transport in all of Europe, in all of Germany, for €49 a month, which is incredibly cheap. I mean, in many German cities, the monthly pass for just the city used to be around €90. So now you have €50 for the entire country. In Austria, we have €3 per day for the entire country, €1 per day for the city of Vienna. So these numbers are kind of negligible, right? It's very cheap, and we can agree on that. And the sales figures of these tickets are incredibly high. The question is just, is that people that have already used public transport? And research suggests that that's the case, yeah? So we're just moving people from the one income box into the other income box of our sales channels, rather than actually attracting new journeys, so new people, and at the same time we're actually inducing new journeys that probably would not have happened. For example, if you live in Vienna and you want to go for lunch to Salzburg, the train is free now, so why would you not? You see, these kind of inductions of not necessarily super necessary travel, which I personally believe in the philosophical sphere is a good thing. It's freedom, it's enriching us. But then again, that's not the main goal at the moment, looking at the climate crisis, right? So my clear, my clear plan or suggestion or recommendation to any policymaker would really be to use that money that is available and put it into the service level. So either enhancing the frequencies of lines we already have, changing lines that are ineffective, like the 1 hour or 2 hour frequencies in our rural areas, and move that into demand responsive services that can create way better service level they might be more expensive than this 1 hour bus, but the return of it is a lot higher as well. And increase the availability of services throughout, for example, the night and weekends and things like that, or to specific tourist attractions during the weekends, because these are the journeys that will in the end define whether someone buys a car or not. Living in the city, you can do your daily business during the week in the city properly with your bike, by walking or public transport. But if you actually want to go to the beach or you want to go on a hike, that's where your car comes in, and that's really where we need to start and invest in these specific journeys that define for people, that give them the feeling that they need a car, despite it actually not being a rational decision.
Brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. Alexandre, what's your view on this kind of pricing policy to make public transport, accessible, potentially even free, versus investing in other types of, aspects of public transport? What's the better investment for you?
My voice is complicated in this case because we only are representing a technology provider, so we have no let's say aspect of giving advice on that. We, as I said before, we are an enabler, mobility policy enabler actually. But of course, having free public transport allows you to not take care of the pricing aspect, even though everybody knows that mainly buying a bus ticket will always be more competitive than taking the car, even more nowadays actually, but maybe not less that much competitive against the bike. So I still think it's always a trade-off. If you are a rich city and you can provide a super high frequency reliable services and have it for free, of course let's take it. But let's be more realistic. I still think that services is still something that will help people convince people to switch from car to something else. In the end, efficiency, usually what we can see it actually statistic from our mobility platform, but we see that usually people prefer the fastest route than the cheapest route. So I still think that service in this case will be the key element. If I need to choose one, at least, I will take more credit to a more high frequency and reliable services than the free services.
Yeah, and you were saying also the value of informing all of this with the kind of data that you're providing. So if your recommendation is based on data, then so much the better. Okay, thanks Alexandre. Francesco, what is your view on this? Is pricing the right approach to get more people onto public transport, or is it more investing in efficiency, reliability, frequency?
I personally don't believe in pricing as a big issue, because when you ask passengers about wrongdoings within public transport, you get a lot of complaints because of the bus not being on time, or the bus being overwhelmed with people. It may be smelly, but very few people will complain about the price of the ticket. So to me, investing in infrastructures and in new fleets, whether it be buses or metro or bike sharing scheme, is the way you will tackle this problem of not having a lot of people getting on board. If you provide a technological advanced way of transport, people will be extremely happy also to pay something slightly more on the ticket. I'll give you just a little examples. Within Upper, we have 10 cities and regions, completely different geographically, and also the approach on pricing is completely different. You have Oslo, which has one of the highest pricing for public transport, and then you have Rome, which has one of the lowest. In Rome, you get a yearly ticket for 250 euros, which is very, very cheap in my view and based on other cities. And the daily ticket is 150. Now as we speak, the municipality wants to raise the ticket to €2, which is a reasonable price to me, but somehow there was a backlash from the citizenship saying that the service is not as good as it used to be, or whatever. They're having a lot of inconvenience, and so they decided to stop these measures, but they will charge tourists €2.50 because the Jubilee will be taking place in Rome next year. So they decided to just swerve to the right and tax more tourists and leave the citizens, the unhappy citizens, alone for at least for a year or two. Not completely agree with this policy, but that's the way it is. But to me, infrastructure and a nice fleet and maybe a fancy communication campaign is the way forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And so the last word then for Bear. What's your experience then with pricing and relative to other kinds of investments? You have, I would say, 2 minutes max.
Yeah, Jean-Paul, that we did experience with free buses here in Hasselt. And we actually stopped that because it turned out that car use wasn't diminished when buses were free, and B, it's never free. Someone has to pay for it. In this case, the city of Hasselt had to pay for it, which wasn't sustainable in the long run. So it was a good experiment. I think it put Hasselt on the map as well, but it was never sustainable. It was never a long-term vision to carry it out like this. What we are trying to do here in Hasselt is make sure that our citizens have extra financial means to pay for mobility services, and not as much give everyone a reduction fee, but give them a budget that they can spend however they want to, because in that way you can build a business case and you can make it sustainable, whereas just making services free is really, it's nice, it's a utopian vision, but that means that money comes from somewhere else, so you're just cutting off your hand in spite of your how do you say it, feet? Other hand. So I think that's if there should be an agreement on a more higher level, let's say federal or regional, then we can talk. But one city in itself, it's very difficult to come up with this and to make it sustainable, because we will never have the funds to do it for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you so much to the four of you for having shared your experiences and your insights. I think it's been very dense. I personally now come out thinking that public transport is not just a vehicle on rails on a fixed line. There are many, many things going on around that. So thanks for having opened the doors and windows on this. And thanks for all the preparation and having been with us.
Thanks to you, Jean-Paul. Thanks to everyone.
Brilliant.
Bye.
So it leaves me to introduce Bernadette Bergsma from EIT Urban Mobility. She is Director of Communications and EU Affairs. Bernadette, over to you then for a few reflections and a few bits of news that you might like to share with the community.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean-Paul. It was a very interesting Mobility Talks episode, I must say. We've heard so much and we have just a little time, but I just wanted to highlight a few things, that it's not about public transport in itself, it's about the integration of public transport with other flexible solutions and mobility hubs on demand. Now, it's also not about public transport, a shift towards that necessarily, but more like a shift away from cars, which I found a very interesting way to look at it as well. And now, are we talking about collective mobility here? Is it all collective, or can we be more flexible when talking about public transport? What is it now really? Now we all agree that it should be reliable, it should be safe, and we should make people aware of public transport options, right? And now at EIT Urban Mobility, actually, we have just launched a course on the fundamentals of public transport, which goes really into an exploration on the public transport system. So definitely have a look at that. My colleague will now put a link to it in the chat. But there's more. So we have a study coming up actually on the 1st of October. We will present it during the Civitas Forum on the 2nd of October. And this study really looks into the costs and benefits of the mobility transition, where public transport is one of the major options that we have. The study explores the transition to sustainable urban mobility in Europe through 12 different city prototypes, reflecting on the different characteristics of it. And it also assesses the costs and benefits of 3 scenarios to reach the transport sector's Green Deal targets for 2030 to 2050, sorry. So investing in public transport is definitely important and appears to be the most affordable way to reach this transition to sustainable urban mobility. But of course, we should also not overlook the shift to active transport, where public transport obviously can accelerate it. Transitioning to more sustainable systems will also reduce traffic fatalities with up to 70%, with improved road safety measures. So there's a lot of learnings from this study. Do follow us. On the 1st of October, we will launch this. What else do we have? Last but not least, don't miss our flagship event, Tomorrow Mobility World Congress. This is really the platform for industry players, people from city and other government representatives to join us to have a debate on how to move forward to really become a sustainable city and sustainable urban mobility. It takes place in Barcelona from the 5th to the 7th of November. Join us there. And last but not least, I really want to thank our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights and expertise. And of course, thank you, Jean-Paul, for the great moderation as always. I hope to see you at Tomorrow Mobility and at our next mobility talks. Thank you very much.